Hi viewers, in this video I will show you how I replaced the power steering pressure hose assembly on my 2009 Patriot.
Not long ago, I started my vehicle and the power steering pump was noisy. I checked under the vehicle and I noticed that some fluid had leaked on my driveway. Later, in my garage, I drove the vehicle on 2 car ramps to find the source of the problem. For safety, the handbrake was engaged and the rear wheels were blocked with 4-wheel chocks. I checked under the vehicle and it was easy to find the cause of the problem. The leak came from the pressure hose. Normally, to replace the pressure hose and bleed the power steering system, the front of the vehicle should be supported by jack stands. To begin, I disconnected and isolated the battery negative cable. Then, I sprayed some penetrating fluid on the tube nuts, those ones on the pinion housing, and this one on the power steering pump. The first tube nut I loosened was fastened to the power steering pump. The two other ones I loosened were fastened to the rear of the rack and pinion housing. At that moment during the procedure, I loosened the tube nuts just enough to be undone by hand. Before disconnecting the fluid lines, I undid the lower fasteners from the crossmember. The routing clamp near the pinion was secured with a nylon clip fastener. The one on the right side was a small hex bolt. Here you can see that the fluid was red and not contaminated. To catch the power steering fluid dripping from the hoses and the power steering ports, I used a common oil drain pan. I lowered the end of the hose assembly in the drain pan, then I undid the upper section. I removed the 13mm hex bolt located on the upper side of the reservoir. After, I unfastened the plastic fastener holding the coolant reservoir hose. The reservoir was then put aside without problem. Next, I disconnected the pump supply hose from the pump inlet pipe. I secured it aside with a short bungee cord. This gave me the space to undo the routing clamp hex bolt from the engine mount bracket. I don't know why, there was no rivet holding the end section of the routing clamp that was mounted on the top of the exhaust manifold. So, instead of undoing the bolt from the manifold, I only had to unfold the end section to free the hose. Then, I disconnected the pressure line from the pump outlet port. To keep the upper pressure line clean and to avoid spilling some fluid, I kept the end fitting. Soon after, I slowly lowered the hose assembly under the vehicle. I placed it in the oil drain pan and I moved it aside. If the O-rings are too old or damaged, they have to be replaced by new ones. Because it was Sunday and I needed the vehicle the next day, I went to a self-serve auto parts facility nearby to get a replacement part. Before installing the part, I cleaned the hose couplings. The O-rings must be lubricated with a bit of power steering fluid to make sure they seal properly when the pipe fittings are connected. To avoid line routing problems, the tube nuts and the fasteners were loosely tightened. Other parts were also reinstalled. After, I tightened the tube nut connected to the pressure line port of the power steering pump. The torque was set to 24 foot-pounds. Next, the tube nut was connected to the return line port of the pinion housing. The torque was set to 15 foot-pounds. At last, it was the tube nut connected to the pressure line port of the pinion housing. The torque was set to 24 foot-pounds. Not long after, I inserted the other end of the return tube in the return hose, and I secured it with the hose clamp. The hex bolts holding the routing clamps were tightened. Because the front wheels were on ramps, I had to jack up the front of the vehicle and put it back on jack stands. So, the front wheels were free to turn left or right. The battery negative cable was reconnected. The basic steps I used to level the fluid and purge the air from the system were based on Mightyvac and Lyle power steering bleeding instructions. The level of the power steering fluid must always be kept between max and min when the fluid is at normal ambient temperature. I removed the reservoir cap to tightly fit the vacuum cap adapter on the filler neck. I used my hand vacuum pump with a liquid vapor separator bottle to prevent damaging the vacuum pump. When the power steering system is under vacuum, the engine must not run. If the level of the fluid drops under the minimum level during the procedure, the vacuum cap adapter must be removed to add fluid. When the cap adapter was properly sealed, I applied 20 inches of vacuum for 3 minutes to properly purge the air from the system. As soon as the level of the fluid was stable, I released the vacuum and I removed the vacuum cap adapter. Then I topped off the fluid reservoir. Depending on the quantity of fluid to add, the previous steps must be repeated until the level of the fluid remains stable. I completed the following steps with the regular reservoir cap installed and the steering wheel free to rotate. I started the engine and I turned the steering wheel lock to lock 5 times. During this procedure, the steering wheel must not be held at the stop positions. Excessive noise coming from the pump could be caused by air bubbles still in the system. After, I turned off the engine and I inspected the power steering system for fluid leaks.
So far, I've been driving my vehicle every day for about 2 weeks and the fluid level is stable.